Passenger aircraft are not certified to carry cargo on passenger seats or cargo unit load devices, such as pallets or containers in the passenger cabin secured on the seat tracks. Any reconfiguration of an aircraft in this manner requires full evaluation of cargo restraints to ensure structural loads are within design limits and the appropriate restraint system is applied. This also requires a formal authorization from the National Aviation Authority of the state of the operator. Our recommendation is, before considering such an operation, a comprehensive safety risk assessment shall be performed by the operator involving all relevant operational departments, for example, ground, cargo, cabin, flight, and engineering. What we hope to do with this webinar today is to cover in detail the highly complex topic of carrying cargo in the passenger cabin, which is the subject of a standalone guidance document. The link is provided at the end of the webinar in case you haven't already accessed. Please join me to call on my team member, Massimo Cischetti, to moderate and kick off this hot topic. Massimo, over to you.
Thank you, Joseph, and welcome everyone for joining this session together with our expert on the transport of cargo in passengers cabin. So while we are speaking and with all our speakers are doing the speak, feel free to post your question in the bottom right corner. We will answer your question at the end of the session, depending on the topic you are asking. So that please do not stop to do question while we're talking. We will address your question at the end of the session. Now, with that in mind, also I want to tell you that during our speakers talk, we will run some polls. I will ask you to respond some questions. So please answer those questions, those polls, and submit your response by clicking the submit button. And with that, it's my pleasure to call our first speakers, our Director, IATA Flight Operations, Stuart Fox. Stuart, it's a pleasure. Over to you.
Thank you, Massimo, and hello, everybody. It's great to be part of this initiative. It's really good to support the industry in these unprecedented times, as my colleague Joseph said. As discussed already, prior to considering the carriage of cargo in the passenger cabin, we recommend that a full risk assessment is completed. So that's any change to the operation is the best thing to do, is to do a safety risk assessment. In fact, that methodology is a good way of working out what requirements you might need to have alleviations from in any case. So we really do advocate that methodology for this exercise. As far as the regulatory aspects are concerned, the development of this guidance has been an iterative process involving many stakeholders. Almost daily meetings we have with regulators, OEMs and operators to get feedback. And the aim of this guidance is to provide guidance which does not conflict with the OEMs. That is not the aim to do that. The guidance, we believe, will help shape the development of policy, procedures and training required for these types of changes to your operation. Various cargo scenarios have been considered, and you may see some of these similar words used in other documentation. These are the carriage of cargo in the baggage hold, approved storage areas, for example, overhead bins underneath the seats, and other storage areas, for example, lockers, etc., that are provided already for storage of articles in the cabin. And then, of course, on the passenger seats, and then with the seats removed, as Joseph said. So if we consider Section 1, it does detail a very nice table in there, which details the various cargo configurations in an easy-to-use format, so you can determine whether these items, for example, if they carry, would need approval, for example, from the regulator, and also where certain articles, for example, dangerous goods, should be stowed and carried. We have not developed prescriptive guidance, and I think that's important to note. which will specifically cover all types of aircraft operating challenges. These should be analysed as part of the safety risk assessment process. We have tried to detail guidance of those items which has been discussed in our interactions with regulators, OEMs, and also following feedback from our stakeholders, member airlines. When we now go to the details contained in the document, if you now look at section 4, for example, it splits into two areas, that is approved stowage areas and non-approved. As Joseph mentioned in the beginning, the aircraft is not approved to carry cargo per se in the cabin. It's designed as a passenger cabin. It's not approved to carry pallets, etc. There are only certain approved stowage areas, as I mentioned before. So initially, when we saw these operations start, the emphasis was focused on operating aircraft using the first two scenarios, that is, carrying cargo in the cargo compartment, where the bags are normally stowed, etc., and the approved stowage locations, lockers, etc. We detailed in that document for the approved areas limitations which should be considered. We don't necessarily detail all the limitations. You need to look at those and make sure it's comprehensively covered. Now, if we then move on to carriage of cargo on the passenger seats, this requires appropriate authorization from the regulator and greater consideration of this non-normal operation, subject to the regulatory framework of this state, as mentioned by my colleagues. There may also need to be an application to the appropriate national authority for various alleviations or exemptions from the various applicable regulatory provisions, for example, to allow the carriage of cargo in the passenger cabin in areas other than approved stowage areas, and to allow cargo to be carried on the seats, for example. And I've been part of extensive discussions with regulators, myself and my colleagues, and interacting with the carriers on these very interesting types of operation. The last category that we consider in section 4 is the consideration of carriage of the cargo on the passenger floor with the seats removed. Here again, there may need to be several alleviations granted, as well as appropriate approval for the major or significant change or supplementary type certificate, STC. And I use those words because it depends on the specific regulatory framework under which you operate. Bearing in mind, you may be subcontracting out that type of work to a supplier. We emphasize the need to ensure that the new mass and balance limitations are established so that OEM limitations are not exceeded, and that is emphasized throughout the document. Clearly, these types of operations have required a huge amount of interaction between the regulators, OEMs, to agree the principles on these types of operations. The principles with the regulators to harmonize the process to obtain the appropriate approval and to ensure that foreign aircraft who land in another state are not issued with any penalties, etc. During the crisis, we did note there was some issues with airspace. You probably are familiar with those. NOTAMs have been issued restricting airspace. So we do offer some very good tips, for example, in the document about annotating the flight plan, which I think is important to note, to ensure that these special types of operations don't suffer any adverse consequences due to lack of notification of the appropriate agencies. We've also included in the document some guidance on slots management, and you might wonder why that is, but we had some feedback from some of the operators of some issues around slots. So we put that in there just to help you out there. The other thing we've also included in the document is references to supporting OEM information, which we include. The reference is not a copy of it, of course, so it's up to date, and also OEM supporting documentation, and there are some videos around as well, which may be worth considering to look at. Now things are changing, so I caution to keep to make note of the fact that you should be using the most up-to-date information, and we at the moment are still having daily, if not every other day, conversations with the regulators as they have to adapt to the situation as it progresses. That's all from me. Thank you very much, and back to you, Massimo.
Thank you very much, Stuart. So before we get to the next speaker, we're going to launch now here our first poll, that is 2 questions. So please provide your answer. That is going to be really helpful for us also to understand the direction we need to take. So as you can see here, you have 2 questions. Once you have clicked on your reply, please type on submit button, that is on the bottom right of the corner. So, and it's with pleasure that I invite the next speaker, which is Nancy Rockburn, Head of Safety Management System, to go even more further detail on the safety management system and the risk assessment process. Nancy, over to you.
Thank you, Massimo, and hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I will be walking through sections 3.1 and 3.2 of the guidance, which talks about the general considerations as well as the safety risk assessment. So touching upon the general recommendations, and I'm just going to wait here just a few seconds to see the responses from these poll questions. So if you bear with me just a couple of moments here. And if we can just advance the slide. Thank you. Oh, no. There we go. Thank you. One thing I will mention, one thing in terms of doing a safety risk assessment, in terms of doing cargo operations in a passenger cabin, one thing as a prerequisite, as a general recommendation, is that as an operator, you're already familiar with cargo operations. And this is key going forward, because this is not the time to getting new regulatory approval to carry cargo operations and such. So this whole document is predicated on operators that are already familiar with cargo operations. So that is something that we wanted to stress. And just wondering, Massimo, can we see the results of the poll?
I think there's still a few moments that the results will be displayed after they have submitted the questions. So you can keep going, and then we'll display the results as soon as possible so that we can comment over it. So if you can go through the risk assessment overall.
Thank you, Massimo. So we'll touch upon that when we hit the risk assessment. Thank you. So as I said, in terms of the general recommendations, it is predicated on operators already familiar with cargo operations. And what we're saying is, following SMS methodology with any new operations, a detailed safety risk assessment must be performed. And with COVID-19, we're seeing a lot of various new operations with various alleviations and exemptions being done. So I imagine as operators, you're doing a lot of safety risk assessments at the moment. So the safety risk assessment will detail, as you know, your individual risks and mitigations. So what we've come up with is a list of risk examples. It's not an exhaustive list, but as Stuart had mentioned, a lot of this is based on documentation and conversations that we have had with regulators, with the OEMs, with our members, talking about the challenges that they have, the considerations that must be made in terms of operating this type of operation, cargo and a passenger aircraft. So as you can see in 3.1, for those who have the document, in terms of the general recommendations, typically operators shall, as we say, perform a safety risk assessment to identify all your hazards, evaluate and mitigate any risks, and then, as I said, we've got a list of possible risks that you should consider. In terms of the actual safety risk assessment, which is in 3.2, what I'm going to do is just walk through it very high level, not going through each of it, but just so that you understand the methodology that we used, so that you know how to use this table and being able to adjust it accordingly to your operations. Now, I do see the results from the poll. So did you have to get your safety risk assessment approved? Yes is good. It's like 429 versus 117 no. That's wonderful to see that so many people are actually doing a safety risk assessment and getting them approved. So that's very promising. Looking at the risks, I see that securing of the load, it looks like the largest consideration of the highest risks. Fire detection and incorrect weight and balance, obviously, also large considerations, but they're fairly equal. So that's good. Our safety risk assessment covers all of these, so there's not one really that sticks out more than the others. So again, our guide should help you go through all of these mitigations and see that you're operating at a safe level. Again, because ultimately it's to establish and maintain an acceptable level of safety at all times. So when you're going through 3.2, the safety risk assessment, cargo operations, one consideration that should be noted, because we've had a number of instances, well, a handful of instances, I would say, where passenger aircraft are denied landing because there's a fear that there may be passengers on board when there actually were none. So one thing that we found was very important is that aircraft notify that it is a cargo-only operation, so that aircraft are not denied landing due to concern of passengers on board. Now, because this is an atypical thing and not a typical operation, when you look at the risk assessment, the event and the hazard and the consequence, the risk rating we've put as intolerable because there are no mitigations in place, because it's not typical that you would fly a passenger aircraft with no passengers on board. Obviously, ferry flights, that happens, but in the days that we have right now with COVID-19, we're seeing aircraft actually being denied landing for the fear of passengers on board. So it's not something that we typically deal with. So then you can see we've got a mitigation action and then the risk rating, making it tolerable. So this is a standard risk assessment model that we use. It's based on the Annex 19 model from CAO. And one thing that we have not done is very intentionally, we have not put in the scoring for probability and severity. What we've done is looking at from a general census to come up with what our risk ratings would be. But again, it would be up to the operator to fill this out appropriately based on their information and their mitigation strategies and the data that they may have. So another section that we have is the cargo compartment. And when you go through the risk assessment, you can see that all of the hazards and risks that have been identified in the cargo department are all tolerable with mitigations. And the reason for that is because we already do cargo in the cargo compartment. There's already mitigations in place, so making that tolerable. There are, however, certain things where we've identified additional mitigations that may be in place, and that's a carriage of cargo-only aircraft, dangerous goods, for improper loading, possible fire, spill, leakage. So additional information about what can be done there. We have some additional mitigation factors. However, when you get into the passenger cabin, general, this is not something you can see in the safety risk assessment. It is pretty much all intolerable because this is not operations that we typically do, so there are no existing mitigations. Hence the importance of this document to identify mitigations. So what we've done is, again, talking to regulators, talking to manufacturers, talking to different airlines and experts, what kind of mitigations can be in place for the risks and hazards that are identified. And that's what this document aims to provide you. So you can see we've got typical issues that we still have in cargo when we talk about undeclared or misdeclared dangerous goods. It's even heightened in the passenger cabin, particularly when you're talking about fire suppression, because there are no fire suppression mitigations in a passenger cabin. That is done through typically cabin crew. One thing you will note as well, and Stuart mentioned it, in the document we try not to be prescriptive. So in the document, in general recommendations, for example, when we use crew members, you could typically use other appropriate appropriately trained personnel. So although it's easy because cabin crew members are already trained to identify, to detect, and fight fires on board in the cabin, if you do not want to use cabin crew, if perhaps you're going to use load masters, which we have seen as well, that is okay, again, as long as they're appropriately trained. So you'll see throughout the document, although we may recommend certain people, certain positions, as long as they're appropriately trained, then they can be used. And it, again, is up to the operator to determine what is best for them to use in those scenarios. Again, we're not trying to be prescriptive in any way. When you look through the next section, it's passenger cabin operational. So this is actually, how do you actually load the cabin? And again, you can see everything is intolerable because there are no SOPs, there are no procedures in place right now for loading cargo into the passenger cabin. So again, we've come up with some mitigations, some recommendations for how that can be done. Again, but it has to be done in the context of what works for you. It depends obviously on the aircraft type, it depends on the equipment that you have, it depends on the number of people you may have, what kind of trained personnel you have. All of that has to come into play. But that's really, it's designing new SOPs to be able to do this. And then obviously training people appropriately. Then we have another section for the risk assessment is the return to service. This is something that's obviously important when you're going to be using the passenger cabin back for passengers. There could be some damage that was done inside the passenger cabin based on the cargo. There could be, obviously, if you've removed seats, that all has to be put in place. When you look at some of the mitigations, like turning off a lot of the electrical supply systems to prevent any fire hazards, they obviously have to be turned back on, make sure that they're working appropriately. There could be placards or signs that could be damaged. There's a lot. So thorough checks of the cabin systems and the equipment, the fittings by maintenance, is obviously a requirement for return to passenger service, even if all of the seats are still in place and nothing was changed. It's something that we find very, very important. And then lastly, the last section that we have there is employee injuries. When you're talking about new procedures to load cargo into the cabin, obviously if the seats are there, there's hazards and issues there that aren't typically seen. How are you getting the packages up to the cabin area? There's typically not equipment that brings that up. We've seen lines of people individually moving the boxes along. We've had elevating equipment being used. Again, excuse me, what works for your organization has to be considered in these times. So I'm not going to go again into detail about each of them. You can see them. We'll answer any questions, but hopefully that gives you an oversight of how this was put together, the mitigation actions that we've suggested. But again, keep in mind it has to be, the mitigations have to work for you, what makes sense for you, and actually reduce that risk to a tolerable level. And then another thing to note, obviously, with standard risk assessment methodology, the consequence you will see in the left-hand side is always the worst-case scenario. And keep that in mind, obviously, when you're talking about what the mitigations and actions in. Again, you're always trying to consider the worst-case scenario and trying to reduce that to a tolerable level. I hope that's clear, and we look forward to any questions you may have. But thank you, Massimo, over to you.
Thank you, Nancy. Just a clarification for all the audience. When we are referring to 3.1 or 3.2, that refers to the numbering of our guidance, so which is clearly downloadable in our website. So all the slides says on this bottom, the numbering of the slides. So please, I mean, when we talk, refer to that if you have your slides in front of you. Now we go to the next speakers, which is Andrea Rizzo, is Manager's Auditing Training. And before that, we are going to launch our second poll of 2 questions. So, which is, are you loading cargo in passengers' cabin, yes or no? So we want to know already how many of you are doing this operation, and then what type of loading operating are you doing? So please answer those questions. There's 1 minute and 18 seconds to respond, and then click on submit button. So with that, I'll hand it over to Andrea Rizzo. Andrea, over to you.
Thanks, Massimo. So while you guys are completing this survey, I can introduce this regulatory requirement subject. Before plunging into that, I want to just join to Stuart's words about the discussion, confrontation, constructive manner we're having with all the stakeholders, and in this case with the regulators. I cannot stress enough that the recommendations that we are receiving are volatile, and IATA is doing its best to work with the regulators, OEM and operators, to really trying to provide solid guidance. So we're gonna go through this into this section 4. Someone is typing.
Yes, someone has left the mic open. So if you can please either Nancy or someone, previous speakers can close the microphone. Thank you.
So those regulatory requirements that we are reporting in this document, in this section 4, which is divided in section 4.1 and 2, are indeed typically representation. I should use the word typically all throughout. To go to the actual content, we do have in section 4.2 and 3 the regulatory references we used, which is mainly about FAA and EASA, also other regulators. And we also got external other references, which is mainly related to the manufacturer and other sources. So please go into the document and see what we used to build this section. As far as the regulatory authorization, we shall say that as a first recommendation, generic to regardless of the type of transportation of cargo you have in the passenger cabin, we do not recommend the transport of dangerous goods and live animals. Should be prohibited in the passenger cabin. The cabin should be considered as a Class A cargo compartment in that regards, and also there should be a sufficient cabin crew and other qualifying members on board to control and mitigate indication of smoke or fire on board. And this is comprehensive for all of the various cases. In here, we do have, let's say, 2 sections. One is for approved loading locations, whereas the other one is for non-approved loading location, as to what was hinting to be either on passenger seats and on passenger cabin floor. So what is approved loading location? By that, we mean those overhead storage bins, closet, a floor-mounted storage, and under the seat storage area. For those, we do have a general recommendation that typically include the storage maximum capacity shall not be exceeded, the mass of cargo should not exceed the structural loading limits of the floor or seats, that the number, type of restraining devices and their attachment point shall be capable of restraining the cargo in accordance with applicable regulation. If the cargo is stored under the seat, it's important that the seat is equipped with a restraint bar system, and the cargo is placed fully under the seat. Typically, the mass allowed for that cargo is 20 pounds or 9 kilograms. In general, items shall not be stored in lavatories against bulkheads that are incapable of restraining articles in the various directions. And cargo should not be placed in a manner that impede access to emergency equipment or hinder egress in case of emergency evacuation. Cargo placed in enclosed storage area shall not be of such a size that prevent the latching of doors, from being security closed. And this check should be made before takeoff and landing, or whenever the piloting commands dictate that, to ensure proper storing of the cargo. These are the generic recommendation that we have for approved. For non-approved, we do have two sections. One is on passenger seats, for which we already mentioned over and over again, there should be a prior authorization from the Civil Aviation Authority to get this kind of operation, or a supplemental type certificate approval. And also, there is a note that indicates that in this case, approvals could be on a temporary basis, time limited. For instance, EASA is mentioning up to 8 months. So typically, the condition applicable for transport of cargo on passenger seat include that the mass of the cargo on the seat should not exceed seat limitation and should be evenly distributed across the seat rows. Now, this seat limitation can either be found in the weight and balance manual or other sources as of the seat manufacturer, because typically what we found so far is that the values of those limits is lower than the normal seat for passenger. Actual weight of cargo and even distribution should be used to ensure that the aircraft flight manual, aircraft weight and balance, and minimum flight weight limits or equivalent are never violated. So just remember, it's not only the maximum limit, but even the minimum ones to be considered. And as a general recommendation, we identify that conservatively, the operational envelope should be used, but alternatively, any operator can develop their own weight and balance calculation for that configuration and identify different operational limit for weight and balance. Cargo shall be adequately restrained. The number of type of restraint devices and their attachment shall be capable of restraining the cargo in accordance with applicable certification application. In here, we notice that in general, regulators tend to indicate that the cargo should be restrained against the seat, but we do have also alternative to that. I will leave it to Massimo to elaborate on this. The center of gravity of the cargo shall be in a position that is equal or lower than the passenger CG, shown in the envelope drawing of the seats. And this is another element that should be definitely accounted for. And cargo load shall be appropriately accounted for in the weight and balance system, obviously, to make sure that the limits are always respected. And there are different ways to do that. As I mentioned, there is a minimum number of qualified staff to attend to the fire, and also some regulators are also indicating a minimum number of fire extinguishers according to the aircraft type and configurations. When we do move into the cargo that is loaded on the passenger cabin floor with the seat removed, and therefore it is attached directly to the seat tracks, typically the following limitation apply. There is a minimum of one complete row of unoccupied seats at the fore and aft ends of the tie-down area. And by unoccupied, we mean that there is no passenger, no cargo in that seats. But again, this is something that can be varied according to the approval you can get. Maximum cargo weight for any given tie-down scenario is recommended by the aircraft manufacturer, are going to provide you with a number of different load limits, linear, superficial areas, etc., so that you do your maths. You can identify those limits. We're looking for a cargo distribution across the tie-down area, and cargo loaded directly on the floor should not exceed the floor limits. There is alternative method to load cargo, and Massimo will go through that in a few minutes. The CG height of the cargo should not exceed the value provided by the aircraft manufacturer. Similarly, the ones of the cargo loaded on the passenger seats. There's also lateral and longitudinal CG limitations, typically plus or minus 10%. Cargo should not extend or hovering into the aisles, doorway, galleys, or emergency exits to ensure there is no limitation to the emergency procedures. Cargo must be adequately restrained to ensure that the cargo does not come loose, of course. And if nets are used, nets should be approved type. The maximum weight can be restrained at the floor limit and vertical limits, and this is another requirement that should be done according to the manufacturer recommendation. The number of tie-down points for a given cargo weight, and the type or number of studs, tie-down, fitting, and strap assembly shall be applied as per recommendation provided by the aircraft manufacturer. Last but not least, attention must be given to avoid load share or restraining cargo into any galleys, lavatories, partition, or other fixed structure. So this is the high-level recap of the three possible configurations for the recommendation of the regulators. And just to close my brief representation in here, please consider that this information are volatile and IATA is reviewing them on a constantly basis with the regulators. As far as the Q&A, I can see that the vast majority of you guys are already loading cargo into the passenger seats. And in regards to the type of loading that you are applying is mostly on the passenger seats, also because that was possibly the most easy to address. But what we reckon is that the removal of the passenger seat can as well become a major factor, which will increase capability. That's all on my side at this time.
Thank you, Andrea. Also, I think it's very useful to understand that there's already some of our members that are doing a mixed configuration of passengers and cargo, which we have not yet covered in our guidance as we don't have enough regulatory material. But that's really an interesting data to look at for our perspective. And with that, now we're moving towards a little bit more operational aspects of our guidance, which includes various sections. And I will start with my colleague, Brendan Sullivan, Head of E-commerce of Cargo Operation, which is going to run through the cargo preparation, cargo warehouse operation, and so on. So, Brendan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Massimo. Hello and welcome to everyone. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to us today. So I'm just going to highlight a few important parts of the guidance document. As mentioned before, the little yellow bubble you see, 5.1, is the section that you can see if you're following along. So cargo preparation, probably the first thing to consider is to establish some robust acceptance or even booking procedures. This is really about deciding what cargo type, the commodity, and the physical attributes of the cargo you wish to accept and then load in the cabin. It's largely the same considerations between approved and not approved locations. Obviously, what cargo would actually be accepted changes and would be different, and there'll be possibly no system limitations to force the acceptance of the right thing. So it becomes quite manual. Not only that, but the loading itself is very manual. That's very important to consider. As mentioned by a few colleagues, the method we use to physically load the cargo, prepare it in the warehouse, transfer it over to the ramp, it's all very, very manual. So we want to make sure that the cargo that we will accept for cabin loading is suitable for that manual. Also, if we're going to keep the seats in place, the loading will be quite physically demanding. That can be a long stretch for someone to lean over, and having a weight at the end of that can be a bit of a physical, occupational health and safety issue. Also, looking at the various commodity limitations and physical characteristics of the cargo that one would accept, it will help the airline to actually be able to provide better communication to their customers who wish to use this capacity. Another example of that would be we've been quite clear in the guidance, as well as the guidance you see from the FAA and EASA on no dangerous goods permitted, and that can be quite difficult depending on, for example, if a carrier wants to accept mail, it might not even be possible with all mail types to determine that there is no dangerous goods present, and therefore it would be the type of movement that you may want to move then in the belly under the normal procedures. Some of the other things to consider are the physical side, so light in weight, fairly regular in shape, and we recommend, sort of moving down the path of more general type cargo. Obviously, nothing wet, and nothing that will injure the personnel who are going to be doing the loading. Often the provisioning of loading and restraint accessories, so straps and nets, comes from cargo and goes over to the ramp. So that'll be important also to work out new communication flows between cargo and ramp as to where these accessories actually sit and are ready for use. I want to also stress that ground handlers and cargo handlers play an extremely vital role here. Including them early in the discussion on the operational procedures is very helpful. We developed a new special handling code, CIC, that's cargo and cabin. It helps customers, airlines, and their partners identify the cargo so that it can be separated out and presented for loading accordingly. And so that communication is obviously extremely important. So that's it for the cargo preparation section. I'm going to hand back over to Massimo and happy to answer questions later on in the webinar. Thank you, Massimo.
Thank you, Brendan. So we move forward a little bit here in the operation, and then we are moving towards, the load control piece, loading and unloading of aircraft, and loading and restraints in the cabin. And in doing so, we're going to launch here another question, another poll, which is related to the equipment that you are using for loading from the ramp to the aircraft. Elevating equipment, passenger stairs, high loader or belt loader. So the difference is the elevating equipment, we mean typically catering equipment or that type of equipment that you use for, let's say, passengers with reduced mobility. Now we'll see soon the poll will appear, and you have again here 1 minute to respond to the question. And with that, I will move towards the section of weight and balance 5.2. So what is the things to consider? First of all, when we are considering this operation, the first thing that we need to consider is our departure control system. How does it work? It is, a system that allows you to allocate weight in the passenger's cabin where no passengers are on board. Now, the majority of the DCS provider typically allow you to allocate weight, even if passengers are not on board, divided by aircraft section. Typically, you can say 0A, 0B, or 0C. Now, what we recommend in the case, this is not possible because your weight and balance system doesn't allow you to do so. Contact the administrator of the DCS and trying to find a proper solution to calculate this weight and add this weight throughout the system. Last option is to have, a manual load sheet, but it's not really recommended for different reasons. One reason is that most likely if you are having, for example, contract with your providers locally for station load control, you might put them at risk of having, a calculation of weight and balance done manually with the aircraft type and things like that. Also, it's kind of critical to have someone on board. There is a company representative, typically a load master, that can cooperate, help in considering all this type of weights and the weights allocation properly. As far as concerned the loading instruction, one of the recommendations we are bringing is to add the location of passenger accommodation, the so-called LOPA. Why? This is because a typical loading instruction consider only where the load is supposed to be loaded, meaning the cargo holds only, and there's nothing that is mentioning about the passenger's cabin. So the LOPA may be a useful document that helps visually to identify the row sections, to identify the cabin section. In some cases, you might have in your aircraft, mention where a cabin section starts and finishes at a given row, could be in your aircraft, or in some other cases, is not in the aircraft, marked on the cabin. So that will turn extremely useful to have this further indication for your loading team and your loading supervision team. Of course, loading Sequence is important, particularly if you have, aircraft that are subject to tipping. So consider that. In other cases when the aircraft is not subject to tipping, such as a 777, you might instead consider to load simultaneously on the cargo belly as well as in the passenger's cabin in different sections. As far as concern loading unloading, when we're using equipment, we have to consider first option could be equipment that is properly designed to dock to a passenger's door. Now, in the case of eye loader and in the case of belt loader, those are equipment that are not designed for docking at a passenger's door. So elevating equipment should be considered one of the best options because it prevents some of the risk to happen, risk of faults of the personnel or also of damaging the aircraft, as those equipment is properly designed for docking or undocking to a passenger's door. However, we know, especially in some circumstances, not all the time is possible or practical to do so. So when you're using your high loader, you might consider if you have proximity sensors or warning devices, you have to consider how to make a good approach to avoid Peter tubes and any other aircraft damage. One of the recommendation is if you have experienced people that is in the business for a long time, it's preferred that you assign them to handle this type of flights, as we are talking here about a non-normal and non-standard operating procedures. So this is one of the key. And in terms of occupational health and safety, what we need to consider also what we are exposing our loaders or what risk. Of course, if we are working on with a belt loader on an open passenger's cabin door, the majority of the risk is the fall from height. So you might consider the use of an harness to anchor one of the person that is close to the belt loader, close to an open door, to avoid any risk of falling, and that is something that should be considered. Other consideration is, of course, the number of people you need to do this operation, especially if you're passing packages on a stair, and also the stress that the body is going through while doing this type of loading, not only loading from the ramp to the aircraft, but also loading inside the aircraft. As you can see here, that's quite an amount of information in terms of use, elevating equipment, stairs, high loader, and belt loader, mostly equal, I would say. So when you're using, I would say, high loader, particularly in belt loader, take all your risk assessment, go to all precaution as possible, prevent as much as possible to create either an aircraft damage, but in particular, an injury to your people. Going to the section of loading of the aircraft and restraints things on the aircraft, of course, there could be different type of configuration. If we are loading on the seats, and we are allowed to do so, there might be two different options: the cargo seat bags and without cargo seat bags. Typically, the cargo seat bags were designed, to load small packages, primarily for mail, and in some cases, although they're good in installing and provide a very good opportunity in terms of restraints and securing the load, the back part of it is that are not really practical in some instances when you have to load large boxes, as there might be the space may be more limited. So in case you are not using the cargo seat bags, which is the majority of the cases, you should consider a proper way to securing the load on the seats, under the seats and the beams. Giving the figures to the load control is another important thing. So if you have, your cargo manifest and the number of package reporting each weight, you have to consider how you're going to communicate and to record the weight per cabin section. Typically, the DCS are not set and cannot be set to consider all the limitation of the cabin per seat, per row of seats, because they are not designed to do so. They're only designed, to consider a normal average passenger's weight, whether you're choosing an adult, male, female, or a child, or an infant. So our standards also in IATA is not designed when we do the semi-permanent data exchange to allow a DCS system to go to all those little details. So that should be a very good communication between the company representative and your ground handlers to record the weight that you are going to allocate in the bins, in the seats, under the seats. That is typically divided in cabin section, and then when you report the load correctly. That I think is quite an important thing. As far as concerned documentation, we also recommend to provide to the captain the cargo manifest, especially for the cargo that is in the passenger's cabin. That in case of any risk of anything, that would be more appropriate response on what to do in case something will happen during the flight. My colleague Jonathan Jasper will cover that in a few moments. Other than that, when we go loading restraints, so we can have seat installed or without seat installed. Now, without seat installed, there can be different opportunity. Also, a tie-down area shall be defined. Consider that the loading on the side of the window may be more tricky and more complicated to do, especially if you have to tie the nets, because your passage from the window to the aisle is more, you have less space to maneuver the loaders, and it's a bit tricky when you have to tie the net. It's getting a little bit more easier if you're instead loading in the middle seat row, let's say, that is removed, because you have more room for your people to tie the nets and do the tie down on the nets. Some of the opportunities that recently has been also published in the website by the Airbus, you may consider to load the pallet, some pallets in the hangar, anchor the pallet in the seat racks and make it like a floating pallet. Then you will have more room, to tie your nets. The downside of it, of course, is that you're carrying more weight. So your litter can be with the net and the pallet around 125 kilos or more, depending on the size. Or in other cases, when you're trying here to tie the net directly on the seat racks, trying to prevent as much as possible the shift of the load forward and aft, which is more tricky because you have less anchor point than in a normal pallet situation. And that is more or less all from my side. Then we will go on question and answer. At the end, if we can be more questions on this particular topic, I will be happy to respond to all your questions. And with that, I will hand over to my colleague Jonathan Jasper for the cabin safety side. Also, in doing so, we have here another poll that we're going to ask you to respond. What type of personnel do you carry in the cabin for this flight? None, training cab crew only, train loadmaster or equivalent only, a mix of cabin crew and loadmaster or equivalent, or trained flight crew in the cabin only. So with that, is over to you, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Massimo, and thank you to everybody for staying online to listen to our webinar. Section 5.5 relates to cabin operations and addresses many of the questions that we received relating to the cabin. I worked closely alongside Nancy to carry out the risk assessment process to identify the hazards, risks, and consequences which may be encountered by switching to carrying a better behaved bunch of passengers as in cargo boxes. Throughout that process, in the absence of any regulation to go alongside it, we really had to look at the hazards, the risks, identify the mitigations, and use the mitigations as the basis for our guidance. And you'll very much see if you downloaded the guidance document yesterday that it is a very fluid document, and as more regulators produce guidance, we are incorporating some of that into ours to airlines to help them consider. We don't favor any one particular set of guidance over another, but we do act as a medium between the regulators and the airlines. One of the big questions that we got asked is how many cabin crew are we required to carry in the cabin, and whether we can get away with carrying none at all. And I'm just looking at the answers from your poll questions, and I think the standout answer is most of the airlines that are undertaking these procedures carry out a mix of cabin crew and loadmasters or equivalents. And that is something that we definitely favor, because cabin crew can be responsible for the firefighting procedures, the securing in the cabin itself, and loadmasters or equivalents can oversee how it is secured in the cabin and assist the cabin crew in resecuring items if necessary. So whoever you carry in the cabin needs to know what's required of them, and the numbers of those personnel need to consider your personal risks, what type of cargo you're carrying, what type of aircraft you're operating, and what type of length of flight and services you need to cater for. So using already qualified cabin crew is our big recommendation, and that's what we've included in our updated guidance that we issued yesterday. It's using a resource that you already have, and it's not encountering much more cost for you to make sure everybody is trained appropriately. Within our updated guidance, we've also added the responsibilities need to be clearly defined, and you need to nominate a person in charge, because that's what the commander of the aircraft is expecting. If something goes wrong, they need to know who to communicate with and who to manage the rest of the processes before an emergency landing, for example. We also have added in that you should have a pre-flight briefing between the flight crew and whoever is carried in the cabin so that they can understand each other's roles. Fire watch activities and procedures, you need to do a review of all of your procedures to make sure you have sufficient personnel in the cabin to deal with them. And then when it comes to equipment, your risk assessment needs to identify what equipment you already have, what cargo you intend to carry, and whether you might need to increase some of the equipment that's carried. And within our guidance, we've also pointed towards some of the newer regulatory guidance about equipment installed in the cabin and whether it needs to be moved or altered or changed. But that's very much dependent on a risk assessment process. So all in all, our recommendation is that airlines need to assess the risks in the proposed carriage of cargo and mitigate them with the correct personnel, procedures, and equipment to deal with any incident which might occur. And overall, we really hope that we've given you the tools you need to be able to do so, and we are here to answer questions as and when you have them. So back to Massimo. Thank you very much, Massimo.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. So we are going now to the last section, and before doing so, then we will have our extensive session of question and answer. So now we are tackling the piece of the dangerous goods, which is also a very important risk to be considered. So I will hand over to David Brennan, Assistant Director of Cargo Safety and Standards, who is in charge of dangerous goods in IATA. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Massimo, and welcome everybody, and I hope some people are still with me. So one of the things that where we have an aircraft where we no longer have passengers on board, under the dangerous goods regulations, this aircraft can be considered as a cargo aircraft, and therefore it is possible to carry cargo aircraft only dangerous goods. And I'm going to stress again, and we probably sound like a broken record, but before doing so, you really need to undertake a comprehensive safety risk assessment. And of course, the starting point is, do you hold an approval to carry dangerous goods at all? If you do, are there restrictions on what you can carry? If you're previously just a passenger operator that has an approval to carry dangerous goods, does that approval limit now the carriage of cargo aircraft only dangerous goods? If it does, then you would have to seek an extension to your existing approval. If there is no limitation, then once again, as I say, you can look at the potential to carry cargo aircraft only dangerous goods. Before doing so, you need to look at your current personnel, their training, and ensure that they understand if they're going to be accepting dangerous goods that are restricted to cargo aircraft, that they are able to do that. You need to evaluate the aircraft and confirm that indeed the underfloor cargo compartment are classified as a Class C cargo compartment. Most large passenger aircraft have only Class C, although there are some legacy aircraft that do have a Class D cargo compartment. And if that's the case, then they cannot carry cargo aircraft only dangerous goods in the cargo compartments. You need to evaluate and verify the processes for the build-up of ULDs and preparation of bulk-loaded cargo to ensure that if you may have some flights that are carrying passengers, that there is no way that you can inadvertently put cargo aircraft only dangerous goods onto those passenger flights, because that is just forbidden. And the other thing that needs to happen is there has to be a proper coordination with flight operations so that the flight crew understand that they'll be carrying cargo aircraft only dangerous goods, that there is an understanding of what that may mean, and that everything works together. So in a nutshell, that's what you need to consider. There is an opportunity, but it is one that you need to go into with your eyes wide open, understanding the risks and making sure that you've got them well mitigated. And at that point, I will say thank you very much, Massimo, and hand back to you.
Thank you so much, David. So now we are going to start to assign and trying to respond as much as possible to all your questions that you have posted. So please post your question. We will have a team of experts that we are going through the question and answer. So I will now start with the first question that has been posted, and is to Stuart and Nancy. One of the challenges has been meeting the requirement for sufficient firefighting equipment, and in particular calculating the number, size, and type of fire extinguisher. AC20/42D gives some guidance, but no method. Any research? So that is to Stuart, perhaps also Jonathan to answer, and Nancy. So in that order, if you want to provide some reply to this question, over to you guys.
Hello, Massimo. Thank you very much. Yes, an interesting question, and it's been subject to much discussion, I've got to say, in the interaction we've had with the regulators. So really, you know, if you use a risk assessment to determine what mitigation methods you have to, for example, deal with a situation like that on board an aircraft, those might include prohibiting certain articles in the cabin. Also, it would also involve determining how much equipment you would need on board the aircraft. Bear in mind, the aircraft will already be equipped with certain amounts of equipment. So you've got to determine if you need any extra equipment is basically the exercise that needs to be done. Nancy, have you got anything you'd like to add to that?
Thank you, Stuart. No, I think a lot of it, as you say, depends on the type of dangerous goods that you are carrying on in the cabin. As you can see from our guidance material, it's really about no dangerous goods in the cabin, knowing exactly what the contents are, so you don't have misdeclared or undeclared items that could cause fires, such as lithium batteries and such. So it's really about knowing what you are carrying in the cabin, making sure that you've got the trained and appropriate personnel for the fire watch, and that you can demonstrate to the regulator everything you're doing to mitigate that risk, and that you do have the appropriate firefighting capabilities. And it really should be based on your risk assessment as to how much equipment you need on board and how many people to operate it. And I'll just, I guess, segue over to JJ if you have anything else to add from a cabin perspective.
Thanks, Nancy. Yeah, many airlines already carry in excess of the minimum required that's on board, so we don't want to come up with any particular suggestions or requirements for how many fire extinguishers are carried, because it's very much dependent on the airline and the aircraft. I know that some operators are carrying additional bottles of water as a backup to any halon or equivalent fire extinguisher. Other than that, it really is mitigated by how the cargo is loaded, the installation of fire breaks, and the training that's provided to the crew or the personnel in the cabin to put out a potential fire on board the aircraft. So yeah, we're not including any particular guidance on types or amounts of extinguisher carried. We're pointing towards other areas of the risk assessment.
Thank you. So we pass to the second question, which is related to the IOSA. So I will call on Andrea Rizzo, who is the responsible of the ground handling section in the IOSA program. If we start to transport cargo only in passenger aircraft, now becomes applicable. I think this question refers to the standards that we do have in IOSA, which is a NIF, that is if you transport cargo. So over to you, Andrea.
Okay. Interesting, because we're discussing this very morning the definition of cargo. At this time, it needs to be using the IATA reference manual. But at this time, the passenger flight that is transformed into cargo will have changes pertaining to the type of operation that will be addressed in the revision that will most likely be introduced in the near future into IOSA, so in the ground section. We do not foresee any significant changes in the cargo section as such.
Thank you, Andrea. So we go to the, I hope we have responded clearly to the question. So we go to the next one, and I will call on Jonathan and Jasper to respond to this. Will there be a requirement to have cabin crew training to deal with cargo in case of an emergency?
That very much depends on what the cargo is to be carried. We already identified in our risk assessment that cabin crew are already trained to deal with firefighting procedures. We can't see any different firefighting procedures relating to the carriage of cargo if it's not lithium batteries or dangerous goods. So we haven't suggested or recommended any different type of procedure or training to accompany cargo in the cabin.
Thank you. And we can also say that if you have any other emergency like that, you have some loose cargo and you have a load master on board, someone or like a technician that can help you when readjust, the load and re-type the load. So to my colleagues, please do not type while we're doing question and answer on your, if you have an open microphone. So we go to the next question, which is, what is the specific role of aircraft manufacturers in this critical change of the purpose of the operation? So I will call here on Stuart and Andrea to respond to this question. It's related more, to the support and the regulation too. So please.
Sorry, Massimo, could you repeat the question, please? It didn't really come out too well.
What is the specific role of the aircraft manufacturers in this critical change of the purpose for this operation?
Okay, right. So the manufacturers are very involved in this type of operation. I can tell you that they've all been getting together, collaborating through various forums to support the industry during this time of unprecedented change and challenges to the operators. So they've all been getting together to make sure that the principles are the same across the board, to identify, let's say at a high level, the risks that would be involved, so the approach can be basically unified. Of course, the different types of aircraft have their own inherent challenges, of course, but the idea has been to get them together around the table, and that's why there's been conversations, not just with the OEMs, that's important, but the OEMs together with the regulators as well, to make sure there's no issues that haven't been thought about. For example, we mentioned the approval process. That's important to make sure that's been thought about properly, and that involves the OEMs. For example, many airlines would approach an OEM to get an opinion for the use of the cabin. Well, they certainly need to approach the regulators if they want some feedback on the use of the cabin floor for loading cargo. Indeed, they need the appropriate approval to convert the cabin for that use. But for example, when you put the cargo on the seats, there would be typically a no technical objection to that type of operation, having considered all the risks, etc., and limitations of the use of that area for storage of cargo or carriage of cargo. So there's been a lot of movement in the OEM front on that within that regard. And as I think I mentioned, there's a lot of advice on it. There's also been some webinars conducted, and many operators have also attended those to get some feedback. And it's vital for that feedback to go to the OEMs, of course.
Thank you, Stuart. Andrea, anything you want to add?
Well, very honestly, Stuart presented it very well. To be practical, what you can read from manufacturer mainly will be the guidance with the limitations and their own recommendations. Stuart already mentioned the no technical objection. Just one word I can say is that when we talk about manufacturer, you should consider also seat manufacturer, because for loading of cargo on the seats, limitations are coming also from seat manufacturers. So you have to look in that direction as well.
Just on that front, Andre, to sort of support what you just said about the seat manufacturers, we have had extensive conversations in some of these forums I've attended, operators asking about limitations on the seats, and as you mentioned, you do need the guidance from the seat manufacturers, but also in parallel, you also need the support from the aircraft OEM as well, because the aircraft OEM issues limitations for the seats, but that actually is fed from the seat manufacturers.
Thank you. So I go to the next question that we also have quite an extensive discussion internally on this particular question. So I invite David Brennan to respond to that. When transporting cargo in passenger seats, is general cargo allowed or only medical supplies? Now, when we talk about medical supplies, I'll leave to David to respond to that. That was a bit discussion in our team.
Okay, thank you. Well, I know that there's been some discussion about medical supplies being treated differently when loaded in the cabin. Our view is that the carriage of cargo in the cabin should be based on a safety risk assessment, and the fact that it may be medical supplies has no relevance, and in fact may be misleading because people may offer things as medical supplies such as alcohol-based hand sanitizer, and that's dangerous goods, and that must not be in the cabin. So we believe that it is done on a safety risk assessment, and as Brendan mentioned, you should be doing an analysis of what's being offered to ensure that you're looking at cargo that is light, easy to handle, bearing in mind that it is all going to have to be manually moved in and out of the cabin and maybe up and down stairs. So I wouldn't get too hung up with medical supplies.
Thank you, David. The next question I want to ask on Adam Truszewski, which is our expert in security. Say, at the end, we need to know to consider, apart from safety risk, is there any security risk in this kind of operation? Adam, over to you.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Massimo, thank you for the question. Obviously, similarly to safety management system, operators should implement security management system and identify any specific, any risk specific for their operations. At this stage, we believe that as long as normal screening and protection procedures are applied to the cargo and supply chain procedures that apply in the given jurisdiction, we haven't been notified of any specific risks at this stage. However, again, I would need to highlight that every operator, depending on the location that is at the pickup location for the cargo, should conduct their own risk assessment, especially if that location is not within the regular network of operations. So I hope that kind of addressed the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. The next question, I invite Brendan Sullivan to respond, is referred to messaging. What is the difference between SOC, seat occupied cargo, and CIC, cargo in passenger's cabin?
Hi, Massimo. Thank you for the question. So there's largely no difference. CIC is the new standard special handling code that allows, it's something that freight forwarders could use to identify this cargo to come to the airline. It's something that the airline can then use in other cargo messages, for example, the booking list, which might be used for build-up planning, and can transmit when they're providing information to the to load control and then to the ramp ground handlers as well. So we've allowed for it in essentially all the standard messages. If I recall correctly, and of course I can be wrong, I don't believe that the other code is actually a standardized code in our system for use in the cargo messaging environment. But it would be essentially a subset, if you want to use it as a descriptor of cargo that is in the cabin. It's cargo that would then be specific for the on-seat location, which in some operations for some airlines could actually be useful. So I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. I also to add that this CIC can be used in the UWS message as well if it is implemented. Also, it's a good consideration that when we give this information in advance, we know how many people we need to plan. So typically, I mean, when we talk about a turnaround time, only for loading the cabin of a 777, our operators has reported to us it could take with 10 people around 100 minutes, if not more. And especially if you have to do all the netting, the strapping, the tie down. So giving all this information in advance is really an extremely useful indication to prepare properly the teams, the people, and also, I mean, to plan our operation. I go to another question that I want to address to Andrea. Hi, it is allowed to load cargo exceeding the seat height.
Well, in general, no. The recommendation from the regulator to respect this height. So the simple answer to that, I would say no.
Thank you, Andrea. The next question I want to call on Joseph Sweden. Is IATA coming up with any training for cargo on seat model operation or any other help for our members?
Yeah, thanks, Massimo. Yes, eventually we just came up with a very good questions right now that we have received that from the audience. I am a medium-sized carrier and we do not operate a freighter aircraft, but we would like to use our passenger planes for medical cargo. But we are not sure how to do it or how we would let shippers and forwarders know that we open for cargo business. Can IATA help? Of course, IATA can help, and our IATA consultancy department will be eager in offering a consulting service and provide you with the air cargo tariff and rules, which called in abbreviation the TAC solution, in order to help you on the cargo side, including the conversion of aircraft configured for carriage of passenger to transport cargo. You can find them on the IATA website, and if you cannot, please contact us at IATA at the groundops@iata.org, and we will redirect you accordingly. And also, what we are envisage with the guidelines that has been issued, including the edition 3, it will be available in our ground operation publication in the near future. And also we will have a Spanish translation to follow. I hope I answered the question. Massimo, back to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Joseph. To the colleague that have the microphone open, please avoid the typing so that we don't have the background noise. I have here another question, and how to deal with the FAR 25 and FAR 121 requirements. National agency should specify the waivers and reliefs. Is a master mail needed to be updated because of additional emergency equipment? So with that, I will leave over to any of our speakers to respond. I think maybe Stuart or Victor can respond to that. So over to you.
Hello, Massimo. So yes, if you install extra equipment in the aircraft, well, if you install, you need to consider MEL implications. So the equipment included in the aircraft should be included in the MEL. That needs support of the MMEL. So that does need to be considered for certain. As to all regulatory requirements, and it depends on which framework. You're particularly referencing FAA regulatory requirements there, I think. The FAA have produced extra criteria, for example, for the carriage of cargo on the seats and recently in the cabin with the seats removed.
Thank you, Stuart. There's another question that is referred to. I have seen a pouch box that fits into the passenger seat and gets strapped to it, used for cargo. I just want to shed some light in regards to safety recommendation. Well, actually, can respond to this question. So there's approved cargo seat bags, and now there are some other products that are coming into the market that may help, to secure the load on the passenger seats. Now, particularly, we have seen there are some manufacturers that are providing these products. What we will recommend is that before you purchase this type of things, make sure that are approved by your National Aviation Authority, and your authority allow you to use this type of boxes. And also for the type of cargo that you need to transport, if those type of boxes are suitable in terms of can accommodate for the space perspective and the weight perspective, all that you need to transport safely. Let me see if we have any other question. I think we are responding more or less every of it. So if also in terms of time, we are going to an end. If there's any other question that we have not yet responded, we will anyhow download all the questions that you have posted in our webinar, and we'll try to address them all. So what I want also now to go through is that we have provided a survey that we're going to be distributed to all our attendees of this webinar. Is only 10 questions. It will take you very little time to fill in the survey, but that is going to be really very useful for us to understand which direction we need to take, what further information can we publish in our guidance, and what are, your problems or the things that we should focus more. With that, I will hand over for the closing to Joseph Sweden, Head of Ground Operation.
Thank you, Massimo. I hope you have enjoyed it. And the wrap up on this one, we have listened to lots of regulatory aspects, equipment manufacturers, but the highlight of it was the safety risk assessment, and what we have listened also to the cabin operation, to the dangerous good. But the most important, we really need to get approval and limitation and extension training, and ensure no dangerous good on passenger seats before checking with the flight operation. We do some analytic part on easy cargo to load, and we talked about standards and how are we going to make them standardized or harmonized. On this note, I would like to thank my colleagues, the IATA speakers, for sharing with us their expertise and related work to help us with this guideline, and for being on the panel. We really appreciate their input. Most, our strategic partners, and of course, our training team who have supported us with the webinar, providing the platform and the support to keep it all going. Our marketing and regional team for promoting it. And of course, Massimo, thank you for leading this initiative and putting together this webinar. And most of all, thanks to you, our audience, for your participation, your question, for sharing our point of view. We would like to remind you that please to complete the survey that we will be sent out shortly after the webinar. As our Director General and CEO, Alexandre de Juniac, said, this is an unprecedented crisis, but stay strong. We will get through this together and will keep the world connected. Please stay healthy, stay safe, and thank you.